The CTP unequip event happens in 2 days. Gwen just dropped, so now is the perfect time to re-rank the top 10 best characters for all 9 of the most relevant CTPs. Now, if you're an eagle-eyed viewer, you would have heard that I only said 9. In the past, we've done 10 CTPs, but we are axing the Patience and Transcendence from this list, along with the Veteran. They are simply either too hard to get in the case of a Veteran, or too irrelevant in the case of a Transcendence and Patience. If you want to know my thoughts on those CTPs, you're going to have to go back and watch the previous videos. I'm trying to keep this one nice and lean. Kicking off the list, we have the Insight CTP, and here are my top 10 choices for characters to equip one of these bad boys, especially if you can reforge it to a Mighty or a Brilliant. As you can see there from the reforge options, you have 2 really strong effects with no bad options. You either increase damage dealt to boss types, which is fantastic for world boss content, ABX, ABL content, GBR content, like most of the meta PvE content. And then on the flip side, if you don't roll that one, you roll decrease additional pierce damage. Now keep in mind, you have to multiply that 20% or whatever the percentage is, 0.2. You have to multiply that by the amount of pierce incoming to calculate. So reducing additional pierce damage by 20% is actually reducing it by 5% if the enemy has 25% pierce. So just keep that in mind as far as the math goes. However, the Inside CTP is fantastic, I think, for a lot of different support characters, just because of how flexible it is. Like, sure, you can give an insight to Wave, to White Fox, to Morgan Le Fay to crank out more damage in those PvE game modes, or you can give it to somebody like Wasp, who's essentially the best character in the game for Otherworld Battle because of her versatile tier 2 passive. So giving her a Mighty CTP of Insight, giving her that additional pierce damage received reduction is just a fantastic use of it, and I think one of the best and strongest choices now in the game. Up next, we got the CTP of Greed, and keep in mind this is one of the CTPs that has to be reforged. So if it's not reforged, then it's not on the list at all. It's irrelevant. It has to be a Mighty or a Brilliant to be considered useful in some way or another. Now, the list of 10 here has changed quite a bit over the months, especially with the adoption of Otherworld Battle. Having a ton of burst damage and being able to burst down opponents with the ambush effect is very, very helpful. And also being able to reduce the incoming reflect damage you receive is very helpful, because when you have 2 or 3 enemies on the field at the same time, you're much more vulnerable to reflect, because if there's 2 enemies that reflect and you're hitting an AoE using an AoE attack, you could be taking reflect damage from 2 or 3 sources simultaneously. So it's a very, very strong CTP. In my opinion, the Greed CTP's value has only gone up recently. So if you're someone who has this and you're wondering what to do with it, smash 2 together or more and get a Mighty or a Brilliant, and then start banging away. As you can see from the list, Wolverine and Carnage brand new, Atom is still here, Spider-Man is still here. For the most part, you want high burst damage characters who are able to survive a couple of hits. So either having a lot of native dodge like Spider-Man, having a lot of defenses like Jean and sort of ways to heal, or having the immortality passive that Wolverine and Carnage both have. That means you can also magic on this list. You can also extend this logic to other characters that have immortality, although they're not going to perform as well because they don't have other effects that you need. But just keep in mind that that's sort of the idea of the Greed, is to be a massive glass cannon. Moving along to the Egg, another CTP that is irrelevant until it is reforged. So I'm only talking about Mighty CTPs of Refinement. I'm only talking about Brilliant CTPs of Refinement, or as we dub it, the Egg. Now this list hasn't seen much movement here. I did add Atom in just as an option, but the other big one is Colossus, who I mentioned at the top of the video. Why he wasn't in the Insight list is because he is now in the Egg list. And why is he here? Because he still brings a lot of value to a game mode like Otherworld Battle because of his support buffs, but you can actually use him as a threat offensively to try and mitigate and sort of take back some of that damage that you're taking and sort of deal it back to characters like Carnage, like Wolverine, all of the physical damage characters that are seeing a resurgence because of the ban lists in things like Otherworld Battle. So Egg works fantastic on reflect characters. That's why you also see Luke here, Emma, Destroyer, and it's also the de facto best CTP for Hulk now. I know a lot of people were confused about this, but yes, the Egg is better than the regen for Hulk, because the Egg, when it procs the vitality effect, it gives Hulk super guard break immunity, which allows him to attack without being interrupted during that effect. So very, very strong CTP, very valuable for the PvP game modes that we are seeing lately, and quite a few new faces. Judgment, on the other hand, hasn't seen much of a shift. We add Miles Morales to this list in the 3rd rank, and then I added Professor X to the 9th rank, just to let you guys know that he can absolutely work with that if you're not interested in pushing ABX and ABL scores. specifically ABL for Professor X here. Otherwise, this CTP has sort of seen a bit of a drop in use because of how powerful Rage is, and because not a lot of elemental damage characters have come to the game lately, so it just hasn't been sort of their time to shine. As you can see from this list, I mean, at least one of these characters, Scarlet Witch, we're begging for her to get a rework. And then there's a bunch of characters waiting in the wings to get reworks in the elemental damage, you know, Human Torch, etc., who may end up making this list in the future. But for now, it remains pretty steady with the, you know, incumbent sort of dominating the ranking. Authority, another CTP that absolutely needs to be reforged to be relevant. You need a Mighty or you need a Brilliant here for that steal effect. You don't want the all attack, all defense. And the essence of this CTP is you're stacking a bunch of defense on characters that either already have a bunch of defense, like Thanos, or characters that have a bunch of healing but need defenses, like Gore, like Wolverine, like Carnage. So that's essentially the list here. Spider-Man makes it in as well, because if you combine heavy defenses with heavy dodge, you basically get sometimes an unkillable machine, which is pretty dope. And the rest of the list is pretty self-explanatory. Adam Warlock is here, although very low on the list. I don't think Authority is really the best option for him. He needs that burst damage to really chew through opponents, but you could potentially build him tanky if you wanted to see how he performs, but it's not something that I necessarily recommend. It's just that there's not a lot of options for the Authority these days outside of the sort of heavy balance on the top 5, because Greed gaining value has sort of reduced the value of Authority, because Greed ignores damage reduction to an extent, so they sort of counter each other. CTP of Destruction, one of 2 CTPs that I see continuing to lose value as the updates go by. We'll talk about the other one in just a minute. As you can see from the list here, very similar to 2 months ago. The only one I added is Miguel O'Hara. Otherwise, there's just not a lot of reason to use this CTP. I mean, by default, it has to be reforged, right? A regular Destruction just is a fancy obelisk, so it's not worth equipping. It has to be a Mighty or a Brilliant. Now, there's certainly some great characters on this list, like Sharon Rogers is amazing, but a lot of these characters either have use in other game modes where you'd rather give them a Rage or something else, or, you know, it just doesn't really matter, because you don't need these characters to climb anyways with something like this, when you could use a different CTP altogether and have more flexibility. So I'm hoping that future content will maybe make this CTP resurge, but for now, it's sort of waning in value. Speaking of waning in value, we have the CTP of Energy, the first CTP to get reforged, and surprisingly, one of the weakest nowadays by modern standards. With the rise of GBR, with the rise of ABX, ABL, new score caps, etc., Energy is basically at its lowest value that it's ever been. Certainly not as bad as like Patience and Transcendence, but it's just not very good. Essentially, you want to give it to characters who are proc friendly, of course. You also want to give it to characters that you're not going to use for ABX, ABL, or GBR in the most part, because those characters you'd want to give a Rage. But then finding a character that's really strong but is not good, like is good for World Boss Legend and really strong, but then not very good for ABX, ABL, GBR, it kind of doesn't really exist, right? Those characters kind of don't exist. Or they exist, but then they don't have very many requirements for World Boss Legend, like Ant-Man, right? So you sort of have this weird combo. You're probably wondering now, and I haven't addressed it yet, why Kang is on this list. Well, Kang is on this list not because I know Kang is going to be an Energy CTP user, but because I just want to illustrate how the CTP is sort of losing a lot of value. So I actually didn't know who to put there in the top 5. Adam is there because you want that burst damage, and it's an alternative to a Greed CTP if you don't have a lot of Greed CTPs. I was thinking maybe Carnage, but it really doesn't, in my opinion, it really didn't work for PvP, and it also certainly does not work for PvE. It's a very tricky CTP right now. Like, yeah, Thanos is really proc friendly, but you want to use him in ABL because he's an alien villain, so you want to give him a Rage. Same thing sort of goes for Shadow Shell. Same thing kind of goes for Moon Knight, although he can work a little bit better in scores with an Energy, despite being better with a Rage. So it's very tough, you know. Like even Star-Lord is better with a Rage, of course, for again ABL. Sort of goes back to that. Spider-Gwen, I don't have the new icon for her, apologies, but yes, I think Spider-Gwen would be fantastic and would be very proc friendly. She is very proc friendly, so she would be very good with an Energy. We haven't yet tested her with a Rage for ABL, ABX content because we haven't been able to, so that's sort of still pending. So, you know, don't necessarily rush to give her an Energy, but at the same time, the Unequip event in 2 days will allow you to make up for that mistake if she ends up being better with a Rage for just 300 crystals, so don't worry too much about that cost. The CTP of Regen might be the weirdest CTP on this list because despite gaining, in my opinion, a little bit of value from the introduction of Otherworld Battle, it remains one of the lowest in terms of popularity. So basically the issue with Regeneration is it needs to be reforged by default, which, okay, a lot of CTPs need to do that, Alex. That's not a big deal. But it almost needs to be a Brilliant by default. The gap in terms of value between a Brilliant regen and a Mighty regen is almost 50%. You can see the success rate on penetration at the top there. The reforge option is 90% on a Brilliant, but on a Mighty, it's only 50%. So you're losing 45% of the effect. And the penetration effect, which if you guys don't know, it basically creates a shockwave that interrupts enemies. It acts like a super guard break effect, regardless of what skill you're using. This can be very powerful in a game mode where you could be 3 versus 3, because if this penetration procs and it activates, you could interrupt up to 3 enemies simultaneously. So if you can imagine this thing popping off every few seconds, if you're running 3 Brilliant regens, that could be a really powerful effect. However, it needs to be on very specific characters, and it doesn't work that well. It's not a consistent CTP because, again, it's a chance to proc. It's not guaranteed like the other effects on other CTPs are. So unfortunately, I still think the CTP has low value. I almost wouldn't consider using it as a Mighty unless you're just sort of experimenting with the character. It basically isn't the best CTP as a Mighty for any character, and it's almost not even the best CTP for any character as a Brilliant. It's a very, very strange CTP. It lost its value compared to the Refinement as an egg, like the egg CTP, because it even has, you know, it loses out on the HP and the healing and the super guard break immunity that the Vitality proc gives. So it's not even the best option for Hulk anymore, despite giving almost 40% max HP. So it's a very strange CTP. As you can see from the list, we have a mixture of Reflect characters and characters that can stack tons of defense, like Thanos and Agent Venom. However, this is kind of a flyer. This is kind of like a YOLO option, a kind of a quirky option. Spider-Man is the lone dog here, who I think can utilize this one the best because he has such high dodge that he can survive and he can proc this a few times, and he can become a massive headache in his own right, because basically the longer you stall with Spider-Man, the more chances he has to pop his 4th skill, and that thing just decimates opponents. So yeah, not the best CTP, but I feel like with a few tweaks, with a bit of a buff, it could be dangerously good. So finally, we get to the Rage CTP, the most popular CTP in the game. Does not need to be reforged to be good, but does gain value from it. The list here has changed a little bit, but it mostly features high value ABX and ABL targets. With the score increases, you want to give your Rage CTPs ideally to these characters so you can maximize your scores, so you can continue to stay in an active alliance, so you continue to reap all the benefits of those game modes. So Magneto moves up, Dr. Octopus moves up, Star-Lord jumps in, Gamora jumps in, and then Iron Man, Thor, they drop lower down, because now you don't even need Iron Man for ABX because you just use Magneto for all of those days, or you use Star-Lord when you can't use Iron Man. So very, very powerful new sort of setup here. And then you have Storm at the end there. It was a debate between Storm and Professor X, but both of them are kind of low value targets for a Rage, despite being best in slot for their specific days of ABL. But by and large, this is a CTP that you're building for ABX and ABL, and then also for GBR. Thankfully, most of the characters in this list are also very good at GBR, so you sort of get a 2-for-1 or 3-for-1 in some cases for that CTP. So that's the list, that's the ranking, that's how it breaks down. Hit me up down below. Hit me up down below in the comments. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching. Smash the like button, it helps out the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.